All right, thanks. I'm going to lead us off with just a quick intro. I'm Jennifer McNeely, and to talk about the Translation and Implementation Special Interest Group, or SIG, I'll just say personally, I was so excited when I heard about the SIG being formed a few years ago because it seemed like such a natural, given the CTN's overall goal of expanding the reach and the quality of treatment in real world settings and all of our collective experiences of the challenges of doing that. And CTN has had a tradition of really great and impactful dissemination products, but I think that this group, what we've seen is it brings together researchers and including early stage investigators who are really explicitly focused on implementation science. And I think that it adds a lot of value to the network. So the SIG is led by Mark McGovern. Mark has so much going on that it's hard to summarize it in a brief intro, but he is known to many of us already. He's professor and associate chair of translation and implementation research in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the Department of Medicine at Stanford University School of Medicine. His main focus of his work is on the implementation and sustainment of evidence-based interventions in healthcare systems. And he's well recognized as a leader in the field, in our field, especially focusing on the delivery of mental health and addiction services. Mark also directs the Stanford Center for Dissemination and Implementation, which is home to not one, not two, but three research centers that are funded by NIDA, HEAL, and SAMHSA. And he leads the SIG. And I'm going to hand things over to Mark.
Thanks, Jennifer, and hello, everyone. I hope you can stay strong and stay with us up until the break. This is probably a disadvantageous time to be sharing the good work that Sophie and Joe and others have been part of. I'm not driving the slides, so Sophie, could you advance them? I think you've got the power here. So with reference to the SIG, we're really interested in trying to elevate, escalate the use of implementation, rigorous implementation science methods and measures, not just to do it, but to do it well. And we think that these methods and measures can be applied to all stages or phases of an intervention, from development through effectiveness studies. And the SIG is non-exclusive. It's open to everyone and anyone. If you haven't heard about it, please come and join us. Next slide. I always like to start with this just to help people think about how they might use implementation methods and measures. And it's a basic true or false quiz. We're not collecting anyone's responses here. So true or false, implementing a new or adapted intervention and evaluating it is implementation science, and that's false. Delivering an evidence-based intervention in a new way is implementation science study, such as a digital intervention or using peers or community health workers. That's also false. If you are an intervention developer or trialist, someone else should worry about translation to routine care settings. And I think this is an audience that would say, yep, this is also false, that this is what we're all about, trying to translate effective treatments into routine practice settings. And then the last question is qualitative methods, typically key informant interviews for barriers and facilitators, are enough of implementation science in most research projects. And the answer to that, and to be consistent, is false as well. So next slide, Sophie. The CTN, the T&I SIG has remarkably been up and running for 4 years, which, as I think about it, is preposterous. It seems like it's gone by very quickly. It's a highly energetic and energized group, kind of new people coming all the time. We meet every other month. We've had 20 sessions to date, and the participation is quite strong, ranging from 84 to 125 people per meeting. which is, I think, a strong indication of pretty widespread interest in using implementation science methods. Sophie, next slide. So it meets, for those of you that are interested, Tuesday mornings, if you're in the West Coast, and then at noon, East Coast. We have a kind of a main SIG. It's a big tent with expert presentations, research in progress, and new late-breaking methods and measures. We have 2 work groups that have been up and running really from the beginning, one on implementation strategies. And interesting, relevant to the previous presentation, the implementation strategies work group is focused on strategies to decrease stigma. So there might be some synergy there. And the group that we're going to present today, or that is going to present today, is the implementation outcomes work group. And this has really been a highly productive work group. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Joe Glass, to take it from here.
All right, thanks everybody. Thank you for providing the opportunity to present today. Go ahead, next slide, Sophie. We're excited to share the results of our systematic review that details how CTN investigators have incorporated measures of implementation outcomes in CTN's funded studies over the past couple of decades. Go ahead, next slide. So before we get started, just want to acknowledge the dedication of all these work group members. These are all co-authors on our study, and everybody here contributed to the study's conceptualization or the data collection. Next slide. Also wanted to thank the PIs of the CTN studies that we reviewed. Many of you shared your protocols and they were excellently written. We also wanted to thank SIG group members who are not part of our smaller implementation outcomes work group. Many people provided feedback on this work as it develops. And lastly, wanted to thank the CTN Publications Committee for rigorously reviewing the manuscript that Sophie's leading. We just received excellent feedback this morning, so thanks so much. Go ahead, Sophie. So the study received no direct funding support, but the authors were supported via a variety of funding sources. Next slide. Okay, so the CTN has, as you know, has worked towards providing new addiction treatment options to community-based practices over the past couple of decades. And concurrently, the field of implementation science has developed. And implementation science focuses on the systematic study of approaches to increase the use of sustainment, to increase the use of and sustainment of evidence-based practices. The CTN is a cohesive network of clinical trialists with a common mission. So it offers a unique opportunity to study and potentially improve the study of implementation outcomes measurement. And the goal is why would we want to do that? Well, we want to see novel addiction treatments be able to be more readily scaled into community practices. A lot can be learned from the decisions that CTN investigators have made when specifying their trial protocols. Go ahead, Sophie, next slide. Okay, so I'll start with sharing some really basic definitions of the constructs that we'll discuss today. This slide here was published in Implementation Science Communications Journal by Jeff Curran and colleagues. It's really nice. It's a simple implementation science teaching tool. And it goes like this. As clinical researchers, we are often studying a thing, and that thing is typically a new innovation, new intervention, or clinical practice. Whereas effectiveness research studies whether the thing works. Implementation research studies how to best help people like clinicians or places like addiction treatment agencies do or deliver the thing. And implementation strategies, it's the stuff that we do to try to help people do the thing. We'll talk about some implementation strategies today. They're essentially the interventions of implementation science. And finally, implementation outcomes measure how much or how well the clinicians or agencies do the thing. So thanks to Jeff Kern and colleagues for that teaching tool. Here is in 2009 and in 2011, Enola Proctor and her colleagues created this model of implementation research, which really helped advance the study of implementation outcomes. They describe this working model here. It includes the assertion that implementation outcomes on the right part of the slide, they're proximal outcomes that should be measured to determine the success of implementation strategies. They argued that implementation outcomes are important in their own right, and that they're distinct from client outcomes, they're distinct from service system outcomes, they get their own box. And in addition to being able to determine the success of implementation, some implementation outcomes are often used to measure how well implementation of a clinical intervention how well it might work in a specific clinical setting. So, for instance, the implementation of an intervention could be judged to be acceptable to patients, and acceptable clinicians in a given setting. But the same intervention's workflows could be too infeasible in that setting, or the intervention might be too costly to implement. Okay, so with all those definitions out of the way, it's my pleasure to hand off the rest of the presentation to Sophie. Sophie is the lead author of this work. Take it away.
Thanks, Joe. So the objective of this study was to explore and document the inclusion of implementation outcomes across trials that were conducted in the CTN, characterize outcomes that were included, as well as identify gaps and potential opportunities to strengthen implementation research within the CTN, as well as inform the broader field of substance use. So all active or completed studies that were listed on the CTN Dissemination Library protocol page by August 2021 and approved for development by January 2022 were included for initial screening. In order to be included, they have to have measured at least one implementation outcome from REAIM or the Proctor implementation outcomes frameworks. They also have to have examined a practice change, intervention, or process, and all non-interventional and efficacy pilot studies were excluded. So this is a table here of all of the outcomes that we included along with their definitions. Two things to note was that although effectiveness is included in REAIM, we didn't include it as an implementation outcome for the purposes of our study. We just assessed if they assessed effectiveness outcomes overall. And as well as equity, it's not included in the original REAIM model, but we did include it as an implementation outcome for our study. Okay, so initial screening was done in 2 stages, where stage 1, study summaries were reviewed for potential implementation outcomes and frameworks by 1 reviewer. And in stage 2, 2 reviewers reviewed clinicaltrials.gov study records, study information from the CTN Dissemination Library, and study protocols if they were publicly available. And then in full-text screening, full study protocols were requested by PIs, from PIs, if they weren't publicly available. And then the full-text protocols were reviewed by 2 reviewers, and discrepancies were resolved via process of consensus with the 2 reviewers that reviewed the protocol, and that was facilitated by a 3rd reviewer. As for data extraction, we extracted information including study characteristics, like the study start year, the setting, treatment setting, intervention, clinical target and target population. We also captured the implementation frameworks that they used and whether they assessed implementation determinants, which are also known as the barriers and facilitators to implementation, and whether adaptations were planned. For the implementation strategies, we captured the name of the strategy and the description of it. And if the strategy was very clearly labeled as an implementation strategy in the protocol, it was categorized as labeled by author. But if it was not, it was categorized as labeled by reviewer. And this process was guided by the ERIC strategies. Similarly, for the implementation outcomes, we also extracted the name, the description. We also extracted the data source, outcome level, collection time points, and whether the outcomes were collected via a validated instrument or a survey. And similarly to the strategies, they were categorized as labeled by author or reviewer. In addition to this, we also categorized each study according to the definitions by Smith et al. They were categorized as implementation preparation if they met the definition of characterizing contextual barriers, measuring some implementation outcomes, and utilizing but not empirically testing implementation strategies. They were categorized as implementation research if they were defined as inquiries that examined context, outcomes, and implementation strategies used to scale up interventions and treatments. And if they didn't meet either of these two categories, they were categorized as effectiveness-only studies. So here are results. We initially identified 114 studies, and after abstract screening and full text screening, we were left with a total of 25 studies that were moved to data extraction. Okay. So the start year of all of the included protocols spanned a 20-year period, but the majority of studies began after 2014, and all of the studies were done in the United States, except for one that was done in China. The target populations included adult patients primarily, but there were some studies that also included adolescents, providers, hospital staff, hospitals, and first or second degree relatives. The clinical targets primarily included opioid use disorder, but there were some that targeted substance use disorders, injection drug use, and infectious diseases like HIV. And there was a variety of study designs that were used, like randomized control trials, stepwise designs, and hybrid effectiveness implementation studies. As for treatment setting, primary care clinics were the most commonly included treatment setting, followed by emergency departments and hospitals. And as for implementation preparation, there were 12 studies that were categorized as IP and 13 that were categorized as implementation research and one that was categorized as effectiveness only. One thing to note was that there was one study that was done in 2 phases, and so it's categorized, it was categorized as both IP and IR. As for the implementation frameworks, REAIM was the most commonly included framework, and CFR was the second most commonly included, followed by Paris. And there were some studies that also use other frameworks, including Knowledge to Action, Solberg Conceptual Framework, FrameIS, and there was one study that also used the ERIC strategies. So most studies evaluated implementation determinants and assessed effectiveness outcomes. And the one study classified as effectiveness only assessed an implementation outcome, but didn't use any implementation frameworks. So overall, there were 97 implementation strategies that were extracted across 22 protocols. And there were 6 protocols that use implementation facilitation as a strategy. And as a part of the strategies, as part of IS, they use strategies like engaging local champions and key stakeholders, learning collaboratives, formative evaluations, academic detailing and training, performance monitoring and feedback, clinical consultations, and external facilitators. Of those studies that didn't use implementation facilitation, there were 8 that included training on the study intervention and educational materials, 5 that used monitoring and provided feedback, 2 that engaged community stakeholders via community advisory boards and collaborative groups. And most of the strategies were identified by author, and most of the strategies that were identified by author were from studies that used implementation facilitation as a strategy. Okay, so this is a table of the outcomes that were included in the protocols. Fidelity was the most commonly included outcome, with 29 outcomes extracted across 18 protocols, followed by reach penetration, which was there were 26 outcomes that were extracted. And equity was not identified in any of the protocols that we reviewed. Okay, so this table shows the percentage of outcomes that were classified as primary outcome, non-primary, or were not specified or couldn't be determined. Overall, most of the outcomes were labeled as non-primary outcomes, with a minority being primary outcomes or not specified. 100% of the sustainability maintenance outcomes were categorized as non-primary, and about almost 40% of reach penetration outcomes were categorized as primary outcomes. Similarly to the other table, this one shows the percentage of outcomes and the data sources that were used to measure those outcomes. Overall, administrative EHR was the most commonly used data source, followed by surveys, qualitative interviews, and other data sources. Reach penetration outcomes had the highest percentage of outcomes that use administrative EHR data to assess the data to assess their outcomes, and 100% of appropriateness outcomes used surveys. And sustainability and maintenance outcomes also had the highest percentage of outcomes that used qualitative interviews. And of those that use another data source like study checklists, fidelity outcomes had the highest percentage of outcomes that used other data sources. And there were some where their data source was not specified or couldn't be extracted by the reviewers. So as for if they were labeled by author reviewer, the majority of outcomes were labeled by the reviewer, by the author, sorry, correct myself. And 100% of the feasibility and 100% of the appropriateness outcomes were labeled by author. And reach and penetration outcomes had the highest percentage labeled by the reviewer. Okay, so as for our key findings, most of the included protocols began after 2014, and studies that started after 2018 included a higher number of implementation outcomes. Most implementation outcomes were non-primary outcomes, and that was likely because effectiveness was often listed as the primary outcome. Also, we found that fidelity and reach were the most commonly included implementation outcomes, which may not be surprising. Fidelity is very commonly included in clinical trials and is used to ensure study rigor and prevent bias. But there was another study done by Proctor and colleagues that also found that reach and penetration outcomes were often included in implementation studies. In addition to this, equity was not identified as an outcome in any of the studies that we reviewed. There was a study also done by Proctor and colleagues that also found that none of the studies reviewed in their systematic review included equity as an outcome. Although we found this, there were some protocols that used strategies like engaging key stakeholders and community advisory boards, and also focused their interventions in vulnerable populations. But that being said, there's still room for improvement in ensuring that we have representation of vulnerable populations in clinical trials, and ensuring that we're not overlooking factors that contribute to health inequities. As for the challenges, we did experience a few challenges when we were doing our review, like identifying implementation strategies and outcomes. There were times where an outcome met a definition and looked like reach, it sounded like reach, but didn't have the label reach, which made it very challenging to identify. There were also some outcomes that were listed but not described. In addition to that, it was particularly difficult to determine time points of collection and units of analysis for implementation outcomes. In fact, unit of analysis was initially included in the data extraction template, but had to be removed because of the challenges. And last but not least, we had challenges differentiating the implementation strategies and the interventions. Okay, and there was also a study done by Lengnick, Hall, and colleagues that also identified similar issues with reporting in the implementation outcomes literature, like inconsistent terminology, challenges identifying the thing, lack of clarity in how outcomes were defined, measured, and the data sources that were used, as well as information on missing information on the unit of analysis and observation. So as for the strengths of our study, this is a comprehensive review of implementation outcomes in CTN protocols. And the limitations are that it was limited to information that was in the protocol and the version of the protocol that we received. We didn't review any other additional study materials. In addition to this, the full protocols were not available for 2 studies, and we only included protocols of studies conducted within the CTN. So very quickly, just for future directions, we seek to hopefully increase the inclusion of implementation outcomes in SUD treatment, as well as incorporating measures of equity and employing strategies to address equity, improving how implementation strategies are described in CTN protocols to ensure that we can easily differentiate them between the strategies and their intervention being studied, improve the consistency in how implementation outcomes are labeled, defined, and reported, and potentially provide recommendations for implementation studies conducted within the CTN. And with that, I can pass it on to Mark and Jennifer.
Thanks, Sophie. That was excellent. Really important work and detailed work, and everyone that was involved was a volunteer. So really impressive, good professional citizenship on behalf of the SIG. So thank you for that. One of the things that you heard was the inconsistency of measuring constructs across projects, and I think our field, particularly in the field of addiction, has had a struggle with that lasting decades in many ways. So we're on a mission in the implementation research field to kind of, I guess, fast track towards some effort towards rigorous and common measures, if you will. I'm reluctant to call them standardized, but at least harmonizable measures. So front and center is a toolkit that was put together by colleagues from our P50 center and also another one of the centers that Jennifer referred to. And it's how do you integrate implementation outcomes into effectiveness studies. The manuscript that describes this toolkit is under review at the Journal of General Internal Medicine, led by a kind of a expert team. Danielle Weslowitz from Yale is the primary author, and Joe is part of the paper. I believe Jennifer is, Beth McGinty, and many others. So it's a really good place to look if you're thinking about measuring implementation outcomes. And I think it also mentions that the implementation outcome of acceptability, feasibility, and appropriateness, and you notice that it was generally measured by survey, is not the most robust measure of implementation outcome, and particularly in comparison to reach and adoption. So next slide. I just wanted to emphasize that if anyone is interested in implementation work, we have through our P50 a lot of different, I'll call them stratified options, including a fellowship through a weekly grand rounds. If you're interested in those, there's a contact person, Hélène Chakran-Garneau. And then our last slide, I believe, is really how to get into the T&I SIG. Here's a person, Elena, to email, and then the next meeting is coming up. Actually, it's next Tuesday. So if you're not part of it, please join us. If you are part of it, I hope you can come on Tuesday. So we'll stop there, and it looks like we did good. So open it up for questions. Lisa.
Thank you all for that presentation, and Sophia, that summary that you did of that long period of work across the CTN. That's a lot of work that you did there. Thank you for sharing that landscape overview with us.